Low back pain is one of the most common injuries in sport and work, but what's really causing it? It's not just bad posture, and it's not even one wrong move like picking a pencil up off the floor. Research shows that repeated loading, like bending and twisting under load, can fatigue the spine's tissues over time. Studies by Lehman, Coenen, Larson and others reveal how spine flexion, rotation and even extension stresses can lead to micro damage and instability, especially in athletes and workers under constant strain. And in this episode, we'll break down the science behind spinal loading, tissue fatigue, and how to protect your low back for the long run. All the information that you're going to find in this episode, I've got the references below, and the whole essay is on my members areas at my website, where you can find down in the link below, but I'll talk about that later on. So without further ado, let's talk about spine flexion. There's a lot of controversy around spine flexion, and with any movement of the spine, it will change how the spine is loaded. So spine flexion is one of them. So bending the spine forward will change how the spine and the tissues of the spine is loaded. But what I should say at this point is spine flexion on its own doesn't really present a high risk. So if it's sat on a chair and you're sort of slouching, or you're in the car and you're slouching, that inherently isn't a problem. There are other factors that need to be within just sitting or within bending that will cause it to become a problem. So there is nothing inherently wrong with sitting with a flex spine or bending with a flex, or lifting with a flex spine. What changes is when it becomes loaded, and when there is high repetition of flexion. So if we start now making this sitting for prolonged periods of time, again, this can start changing the dynamics of the tissue within the spine, which can create the instability. So what we have to focus on is not necessarily the spine flexion, but the spine flexion that's in combination with high repetition or high load, or high load and high repetition. Now, with that said, when pain is present, then this sort of changes the rules of the game. So there are different rules. It's not just one blanket set of rules. You should never flex your spine. That's not a rule. That's just what people have taken out of context. What I'm trying to explain here is the rules of the game and the context in which certain rules apply, if that makes sense. So when pain is present, it's more important to remove, or certainly minimize, spine flexion. So if spine flexion is a trigger for your back pain, then it's going to be useful to remove that. And to explain why that is sort of beyond the scope of this episode. But again, there is a mini course or a micro course in the members area where you can learn more about that. So when pain is present, specifically from spine flexion, then it's going to be useful to minimize it. So you might want to reduce the posture that you're in, or reduce the flexion that you're in while you're sitting, or you may want to modify movement, or whatever it is. Now, other studies have also found that the load, so it's known as chronic low back load, so that load has been a significant risk factor. And what they were able to do in that study is they were able to quantify the amount and the load. Now, this isn't a hard and fast rule, but what it does do is it does highlight that as load as the weight and the repetition goes up, load increases. This causes tissue changes, and then this can lead to low back injury. So what they were able to find in workers, so this isn't in athletes, this is in workers, that 15 lifts over a working day at over 25 kilos increased risk of low back pain. So 15 lifts a day at over 25 kilos. Now, how long it took for the back to injure, that again is slightly beyond the scope of this episode, and also it was beyond the scope of the study as well. But what they were able to do is they were able to identify changes which showed the increase in risk. What they also did is they looked at moderate lifting. Well, so a moderate lifting task that loads the low back to 200 Newton meters. So this was 50 times during a working week, would increase risk of low back pain. Now again, this isn't to prove that you should only lift 49 times in a working week. It's there to highlight that there are limits to how much a low back can take, and those limits are determined by the person's condition, the person's injury history as well. So someone who has a healthy back, that back will last longer than someone who has had a history of back pain. But what they are doing is they are using different weights, different loads, different frequencies to be able to try and determine, to try and find, okay, well, let's try and find some general rules that we can follow. And again, the general principle that comes out of this is that it's not spine flexion that is inherently the problem. It's also the load being lifted and the frequency at which those loads are being lifted. But again, the individual has to be taken into consideration with all of this. So, as I mentioned, spine flexion is okay to do if it's in isolation, if it's not done a lot of the time, and if there's not a lot of heavy loading that's come with it. Now let's move on to rotation, or at least add rotation into the mix. Now in the same study, they also included rotation into the equation. So not only did they have spine flexion under load, but they also added rotation into this, and they sort of generalized it to awkward body positions. So trying to make it become a bit more real world, because one of the limitations of a lot of scientific studies is they might be done in a lab, or they might be done in controlled conditions, which may not sort of equate out into the real world. Now, there are limitations to doing science in the real world, is that it's harder to equate because it's the real world. There's many factors. So in one instance, in a lab, you can take all the other factors away, but then you can complain about it and say, well, it's only looking at X and Y. We need to look at it in the real world. Well, if we take it out into the real world, we get A, B, C, D, E, and F, X, Y, and Z, and that's too many factors to take into consideration to get anything meaningful from it. So with all of this, we have to understand there are limitations on either side of the scientific equation, if you will. So they added in rotation, and rotational loading to the lower back put it at greater risk. So if you add rotation into it, it increases the risk that much more. So not only is spine flexion a problem, loaded spine flexion at high frequency is a problem, but if we have a rotated flexed spine under load done frequently, again, that's increasing the risk again. So with regards to reducing these loads, which is something that I've mentioned already, what they came out with was, in order to reduce risk of the lower back, changing posture, lifting forces, duration and exposure should be considered. And this comes down to what I talk about in all of my other episodes, tutorials, workshops, videos, is to be able to go through some sort of assessment, and there is a full low back pain assessment, which includes assessing the lower back, assessing the hips, assessing the muscles around the spine, and core endurance and core stability, which again is all in the members area. You go through that assessment, and what that does, that helps you understand where the problem is. So you can just sort of logically sit down and think, well, at work I'm doing this posture, I'm doing that posture, which doesn't sound too advantageous, so I might need to change that posture. But to be a bit more specific about it, if you go through a full sort of physical assessment of your low back, which doesn't just include the lower back, it includes the hip and the core muscles and the low back muscles, what you're able to then do is to try and isolate a little bit more what the problem is, and then you can go about addressing that, which is exactly what they say in the study. You need to look at the postures, you need to look at the frequency, you need to look at the weight that you're lifting, and you need to start thinking about, how can I adapt that, how can I change that, how can I reduce the postures that I'm in, how can I spread the weight that I'm lifting, so on and so forth. So I could go on and talk about assessing, but if you're interested and you want to complete the questionnaires and the assessments, just go through to the members area, which is in the link below, and you'll find it. So let's now look at the final posture that we're going to cover, extension. Are you tired of guessing what actually is working for your body? Well, it's time to train smarter and not necessarily harder, by joining the Fundamentals of Health and Fitness by me, Chris, from Christopher Hole Training, which is your all-in-one guide to building strength, overcoming lower back pain, building core strength and stability, improving posture, and much, much more. Every month you'll get a Simple Science newsletter which will give you insights to all of those topics. We've got mini courses on low back pain, posture, rehabilitation, building strength, step-by-step exercise workshops to help you move safely and perform exercises correctly and more confidently, and follow along core and posture workouts that you can do anytime, anywhere, because they're equipment free and short. So get involved, join the members area, click the link below, and I'll see you on the other side. Extending the spine, just like flexion, changes the forces and the loads on the spine. Now, because it's the opposite movement, it just changes where those forces go, essentially. The same as flexion, the same as rotation, they just change the forces around the spine. Now, with extension postures, what was looked at were the spinous processes. So if you were to look at your spine in a mirror, or look at your back in a mirror, I should say, you can see all the lumpy bits that go up the back. That's the sort of the tip of your spinous process. And with each vertebra that sits on top of each other, there's a spinous process that goes with it, and they sit on top of each other and sort of glide over each other. So when you flex and extend, they're called facet joints, they sort of slide over each other to allow that movement of the spine. So there is a degree of structural stability because they're sat on top of each other, but they move to allow movement to occur at the spine. And then you've got the transverse processes which come off the side, which allow the rotation as well. So extending the spine puts force through the spinous processes. And excessive forced extension, so take for example a gymnast that is doing a back bend. So they are obviously on their feet, and then they arch backwards and put their hands on the floor. That would be a forced extension into the spine. Now, this may facilitate impaction between the two processes. So essentially, if you want to put it crudely, it's sort of pressing them together or squashing them together. And this impaction may result in injury. Now again, if a healthy spine did that once, it's probably not going to be a problem. But if there is someone with a past history of extension, or even just a past history of back pain, it's going to put them at more risk. So this is something that needs to be considered. Not only is it the physical action of doing it, but it's also the individual that's doing it that needs to be taken into consideration. And again, this is where the assessment comes in. Now, it doesn't just mean, well, it's extreme gymnast movements. It's also been found in volleyball players that spike. So it's that sort of coiling up and then smashing the ball into the ground, and that recoil. So that coiling up and then recoiling back, that can also present additional stresses. And this is something that I've always said, is that sport isn't the healthiest thing that an individual can do. I'm not saying people shouldn't do sport. I do sport. I do cycling, which is probably the worst position from a posture perspective that you could be in. You don't fully extend your hip, your spine is rounded, your shoulders are generally rotated inward. It's a horrible position to be in for 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 hours, whatever it is that one does. But it doesn't mean someone shouldn't do it. It just means you need to take that into consideration with regards to training. So please don't think that I'm recommending that people don't do sport. I recommend they do sport, but they need to understand the negatives that come with that sport, and then how to address and minimize those negative impacts of the sport. So other factors that can also come into spinous process injury would be large flexion and extension ranges. So a very high flexible spine, that will bring instability because the joint is a bit more lax, there's more range of movement, so on and so forth. So that will become a part of it. And a shorter interspinous distance as well. So they can all, again, they're adding into the mix of this this low back injury soup, if you will, because that's kind of how we have to think about low back pain. It's made up of a number of ingredients, and we've talked about a few here. We've talked about flexion, rotation, and extension. We've talked about load that goes into it, and we've talked about frequency that goes into it. And we've talked about putting all of these together as well to increase that much more. So I guess what we can do now is we can go and sort of summarize this and conclude what we're trying to talk about. So point number 1 is this video and the essay that this is based on in the members area isn't to prove that you shouldn't move your spine, that you should be rigid and robotic. It's not there to prove that. What it's there to do is it's there to show or highlight that movement shouldn't be taken for granted and that it has its limitations. And that if we do take it for granted and we don't consider these limitations, that it can end in injury, it can end in pain, so on and so forth. And then we need to work our way out of that. It's there to highlight that, and I kind of mentioned this one already, that movement can impact one's health in a positive and a negative way, depending on how it's done. It's not just when you hear these movement enthusiasts and proponents and they're saying our spine is built to move, we need to move our spine, there's nothing wrong with loading the spine. That depends. If we take that for granted, it's going to end in trouble. So what we have to do is we have to understand where the limitations lie. We have to understand ourselves as well, because as I've mentioned, there are individual aspects that will put us higher risk or put us at lower risk, which we need to consider. So movement can impact us in a positive or a negative way depending on how we do it. There's a time and a place for all of this. It just depends on the individual's condition. As I've mentioned, don't take movement for granted. Understand, have you had back pain in the past? You need to get and understand that back pain before you can understand what you need to do, can do, and want to do in the future. Because there's nothing wrong with going back to full movement. It may just mean a different path for you to get there. It's not, right, perform these 4 exercises and your back will be bulletproof or whatever. We need to take our specifics into consideration, which you can find out in the members area through the assessment. Under low loads and frequencies, the spine is at a lower risk. So this is a part of the context that I try to talk about. And you can move more when there's low load and low frequency. So you're not lifting big heavy weights and you're not doing it a lot. You're at very low risk. However, under high loads and higher frequencies, you are at more risk. That doesn't mean it's going to happen or it's going to happen in 6 days' time. What it does mean, it just puts you at a higher risk. Again, the type of spine that you have will play into that. So we have to understand these things before we can move forward into just full-blown exercise, fitness, whatever it needs to be. So that is a brief summary of injury mechanisms of the spine. It's not as simple as people talk about. You may even have heard people talk about multifactorial. Well, what I've tried to do here is what a lot of people don't do. They don't talk about what the multiple factors are. Flexion's one of them, rotation's another one, extension's another one, frequency of those 3 is another one, load on those 3 is another one, how many of those are combined is another one. So these are all the multiple factors that we need to come to understand, and what we then start to get is a picture of what our back can take care of, and then that gives us essentially our route through rehabilitation. So many thanks for watching. My name is Chris, and I will speak to you in the next episode.